God doesn't ask you to go through things for no reason. There's always a purpose. There's always a plan. It may not be anything that you understand. Some things we're not meant to understand. Mom was here for the right amount of time. It wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I needed. But it was her time. I know. I'll see her again.
You try not to make these cases too personal, but no matter how hard you try, they are personal when you do look at the photograph of a young child and realize how they died. Children aren't supposed to die that way. This is the first time that I'd ever come across a serial killer. Is this someone who was still out there? Who is that person? Where is that person? Is that person dead? Is that person in jail? Is that person out committing other homicides that I don't know about?
In any other world, we would never had anything in common. But because this horrific thing happened to us, we have this bond now that will never be broken, no matter what goes on in our lives.
Hey, Kimberly. I know how hard today is for you. But I want you to remember something. Your story is your story. Even though we all hurt the same way, we all had very different experiences. You have survived so much. And you're gonna survive today too. Okay? I love you. Bye.
This is probably like one of the last pictures she took before everything happened. She didn't even make it to my age. My mom was from Thailand. My dad was in the Vietnam War. That's how they met. When my parents divorced, I went to live with my dad and my stepmother. My brother went to live with my grandmother, and my mom lived with her boyfriend and his 2 kids. We were starting to really get close right before everything happened. That's when I really started spending my most time with her, was towards the end. My father picked me up from school. He really didn't say anything. He was just quiet on the ride home. He didn't say nothing to me, nothing. I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know what it was. I knew by the look on his face something wasn't right. It was kind of disbelief. didn't understand quite what he was saying to me. I mean, I understood she was gone, but it wasn't like sinking in the whole severity of it. Dad didn't really say much. I don't think he could. It was hard for him. I know he loved my mother. I just remember holding Timmy and telling him that we'd be okay. That as long as we stick together, we'd be fine. But we lost our mom. I knew nothing was ever going to be all right. Can we stop, please?
Mom got up every day before the sun. She would run different routes every day. She ran when it was 100 degrees outside. She ran in sleet and snow. And I remember her coming home with icicles in her hair because the sweat had frozen. It was something she did for herself. And there wasn't a lot in her life that she did for herself. I think it brought her peace. May 23rd, 1988 was a Monday. I got up to get ready for school. I lived with my mom, her boyfriend Perry, and my 12-year-old brother, Danny. The house was still quiet. Danny and Perry were still asleep, and Mom was out running. It was the typical Monday morning. Grabbed my book bag, went to school. As soon as I was in front of the door, it opened, and Perry was there. And that's when he told me that she hadn't come home. He asked me when the last time I saw her was, and I told him last night. She gave me a really long hug and stroked my hair. And told me she loved me and good night. And that was the last time I saw her. I needed that hug. I needed to hear her tell me she loved me. I found her phone book. And I started calling people.
Have you seen my mom?
Her friends, therapists.
Have you seen my mom?
And I got the yellow pages out and I started calling hospitals. I didn't know what else to do.
inform you, we found Elaine.
They found her body in a farmer's field a few miles from the house.
She was murdered.
They did tell me that she had been raped and stabbed to death. I remember hearing my brother in his bedroom let out a howl. He howled like a wounded animal. And I couldn't help him. Couldn't even help myself. They kept reassuring us that they would find out who did it, but no suspects, no theories at that point. For a lot of years, I waited and I prayed and I yelled at God. I yelled at God.
In 1997, I was a cold case investigator for the homicide unit. I was the only investigator at the time, and we had about 24 cold cases on the books. I had to sit down every day and go through logbooks that were older than I were at the time, and go through cases and determine what cases we were going to work. Lisa's case was the first case I looked at because it was the newest case. Lisa Hanel was a straight A student, 14-year-old girl who lived with her mom. She would normally leave her apartment, walk a short distance to school, go to school, and then come home. One day, when her mother got home in the afternoon, she got a phone call from the school saying that Lisa did not show up for class that morning. Meg, Lisa's mom, by each tick of the clock, became more anxious. Meg's boyfriend decided that he would go out and look for Lisa, retrace the path that she would walk to school every day. At some point, he looked out into a wooded ravine area just prior to where the school property was, and he saw something. He realized it was a body, and he also realized it was Lisa. You're looking at someone's daughter. You're looking at a 14-year-old girl who's laying in the woods in January, frozen, who's completely nude and has been murdered. You try not to make these cases too personal, but no matter how hard you try, they are personal. When you do look at the photograph of a young child and realize how they died. Children aren't supposed to die that way. What I wanted to do was take a look at the physical evidence, look at the crime scene, As an investigator, our job is to provide answers and not allow the person responsible for that type of damage to get away with it. But I never thought I'd ever come across a serial killer.
I remember my aunt telling me I should say goodbye, touch her, give her a kiss if I wanted to, but I was too scared to touch her. They had so much makeup on her, like too much makeup. You ever seen a mannequin? That's what it looked like to me at that age. Like it was just a mannequin laying there. It kind of resembled my mother, but it wasn't her. And that was my last memory of my mother. It was obvious that it went cold. It was maybe 4 years later when me and Timmy went to the police station. They called us and asked us if we can come pick up her personal belongings, that they didn't need them no more.
Thank you.
Wasn't sure what we were picking up. You know, a lot of anxiety. The officer gave us a brown envelope. She had her wallet still and her jewelry. It was just, you know, weird, odd. Like, just to think that she once held it and now I'm holding it. It made it like it was all real again. And it was just one of those things I kind of accepted at that point, that I probably would never know who killed my mother.
When Lisa was murdered, the police didn't know who did it. There was a lot of fear in the community. Every parent that sent their child to that high school was concerned that their child was going to be the next victim. The biggest piece of evidence that they found at the crime scene was a Newport cigarette. That cigarette was 17 feet from Lisa's body. It was out of place. It had unknown blood on the end that you would light, and eventually we found that it had saliva on the filter end. We knew it wasn't Lisa's saliva on that filter end. We knew it was somebody else's, just didn't know who that was. At the time, the investigators focused on a relative or a close family associate initially, and then pursued leads of other individuals that were known to hang out in the area. But they never really had any idea who did it. At the time of Lisa's case in 1993, DNA was really at its infancy. Now, in 1997, DNA technology had advanced to the point where we felt comfortable using the evidence. So that's where we started, getting search warrants for people's saliva, getting consent to do DNA testing on those individuals. The 1988 case, Elaine Sharika, she was murdered not far from her home while she was jogging. The Sharika case file was in archives at the time. It was literally sitting in a warehouse collecting dust. Elaine's running path was basically through her neighborhood. And then at some point, she would turn down a pretty isolated road that would go down into eventually what became a park. But both sides of the roadway are wooded. A farmer in the area called the police department saying he located a body in the field. Police department responded. It was immediately apparent that it was Elaine's body. She was sexually assaulted. She was not only strangled, but she was also cut very deeply on her neck. And I remember reading that case file and the brutality of it, looking at the crime scene, looking at the photographs, thinking to myself, wow, this case has to be brought out and looked at. We had no suspects. The case really wasn't going anywhere.
Sometime after my mother's death, I learned that my mom had had an altercation with Michael. Michael and I were coworkers and friends. I was 17 and he was 4 or 5 years older than me. He had asked me out several times and my mother had forbid me from dating him because he was too old for me. My mom's boyfriend, Harry, relayed a story to me that happened a few weeks before she died. Michael had come looking for me, and she asked him to leave.
What happened between you and my mother?
I came over to see you, and she went all psycho on me.
She had actually pushed him off our front porch because he was yelling at her. Michael acted very odd in the days and weeks after Mom's death. He had tried to commit suicide, was in the hospital. Just didn't sit well with me. He wasn't somebody that would have immediately popped into my head of this is who I think killed my mother. But his behavior was very suspicious and made it just that much easier to draw the line. If I hadn't known him, if I hadn't been friends with him, if I hadn't socialized with him, they wouldn't have known each other. That was a really dark time for me to think that I could have brought this person into our lives that took her life. I was convinced it was him. I was convinced it was him and that it was my fault.
Hey, Michael, why don't you tell us what happened?
I already told you I don't know anything about Elaine.
They questioned him about my mom's death, and he said he didn't know anything about it. They were able to find Chris's body. He was beaten to death with a baseball bat. So shortly after he pled guilty to Chris's death, the detectives asked if there was any chance that he could have been the one to have killed Mom. And it was pretty easy to draw the line. I was absolutely convinced it was him. That he had done it. It was a matter of time. They were going to figure it out.
Michael was a strong suspect in the case from the beginning because he had a relationship with the family. There was animosity between him and Elaine. He had violent tendencies at the time. He was seen as somebody who was violent, somebody who was capable of committing this homicide. During the initial investigation, investigators had interviewed Michael to try to determine if he was associated with the crime at all. He had motive, certainly had opportunity. Detectives worked it very hard, but nothing really developed in the case. He remained a suspect for a very, very long time.
I didn't have no idea how much it was going to affect my life. How much it affected my brother's life. Definitely hit Timmy harder. I think because he knew her better. He was older, understood it more than I did. Timmy couldn't handle it, so he escaped into drugs to deal with it. There was times when he was in drugs, and no matter what he was doing, I would get my pillow, my blanket, and I would just go in the car and go with him because I wanted to make sure he was okay doing it. I figured if I was with him, it was a less chance of something bad happening. He was lost. That's why I felt like I had to take care of him. Timmy was always felt like he was lost. I don't think he ever felt like he belonged anywhere after. That one event even took him from me. I know people say he did it to himself, but when he went down that path, if she was still here, I don't think he would have. I really do miss him. He was my best friend. I'm done with that one.
So Michael was the prime suspect in the case, always had been, and he was a strong suspect. But we were able to eliminate him as being a contributor to the DNA we recovered off of Elaine's body. Looking at the cases, they had distinct similarities. The 1988 case, Elaine Sharika, she was murdered not far from her home. Lisa Hanel case in 1993 was not in the same community, but it was only a 10-minute drive away. What struck me in the Sharika case was, again, early morning crime of opportunity. The person probably knew that that was her jogging route. Probably had seen her done that before. The offender parked in that field so she would never know he was there. Someone had actually laid in wait, planned it out. Lisa's case, very similar type of crime. The early morning attack, laying in wait for Lisa as she's walking to school, laying in wait for Elaine as she's running. Both of them were immediately assaulted, drugged into a more isolated area where the offender committed the homicide and either a sexual assault or an attempt at a sexual assault, and then fled. I'm looking at the evidence, I'm looking at the MO of each one of these cases. It becomes more clear to me they could be related. No one had thought of that before. What I'm thinking is the same person did it. Who is that person? Where is that person? Is that person dead? Is that person in jail? Is that person out committing other homicides that I don't know about? And it's my job to try to find out if those homicides are related. And it's my job to stop this person, or at least find out who this is. Very few cold cases are solved, and they take a very long time to solve. I respected the detectives that worked the cases, but I understood that I was my own person, I was my own detective, and I was going to look at the evidence the way I saw it. One of the things that I did was look at, okay, were there any similar cases to the Lisa Hanel case in 1993 and Elaine Chirico in May of 1988? We looked through the case files, looking at the location where they occurred, the time frame, the MO, the type of homicides, how they'd been murdered. Was it a sexual assault? Was it a blitz attack type of crime? The Boonthem Anderson case, she was murdered in her home in a residential area in 1986. Kind of a blitz attack, sexual assault, stabbing, similar to the other cases. She'd been stabbed in the neck multiple times. She was then thrown face down nude into a bathtub with her arms tied behind her back. I knew she'd been sexually assaulted. The type of persons of interest in the Anderson case that were looked at were just individuals that were seen in the area at the time. They looked at, family members, but no one really stuck out from the initial investigation throughout the years as being a very strong suspect. The Anderson case went cold very quickly. What I'm thinking is I have 3 cases here. My gut feeling was that they were related, and I was going to go with my gut. It was worth taking these 3 cases, putting them side by side, and start looking at every single detail to see what kind of similarities there were. The Anderson 86 case and the 88 Chirico case were very close to each other. You say, well, wow, that's a pretty short period of time in a small area to have 3 women randomly, brutally murdered in the way that they were. That's when we really started looking at those cases, and Lisa's case differently. We thought we had a serial killer on our hands and that he was responsible for multiple cases in the county. What we did is we went through each one of those case files and selected what we felt was the best pieces of evidence to send to DNA testing. You have DNA, now let's see if you can solve it. This is the first time that I had ever come across a serial killer. That was the point where we knew that those 3 cases were related and the same person was responsible for committing those murders. Is this someone who was still out there committing these type of murders? Were they in jail or were they deceased? We submitted those cases to the Maryland State Police to enter into the state and federal DNA database. I was home in my yard raking leaves in the fall in Maryland, and I got a page to call the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. They had told me we did have a match. Alexander Wayne Watson Jr. The name didn't mean anything to me at the time.
He was at the house maybe once or twice at the most when I was over there visiting with my mother. That's why she answered the door, because she knew him. She answered the door because, you know, he acted like he was there for the son. I got in the car and we started driving. He didn't take me home. He turned the opposite way.
Where are we going?
And he's like, what would you do if I try to rape you or do something to you? He locked the doors. And I was scared. I think that, like, I was right there with him.
Where are we going?
Wherever I want to take you.
And he's like, what would you do if I try to rape you or do something to you? I looked right at him. I said, I will make sure they know it's you because I'm going to leave every freaking mark that I can.
Let me out.
And he let me out the car. And I think about that all the time, knowing everything I know now and how close I really came to death and didn't even realize it. I think my mom was watching me that night, was watching over me.
He'd been convicted of a homicide in 1994 in the county next to ours, where he brutally attacked a female alone in her office and eviscerated her with a knife. We then started backtracking, where had he worked, where had he lived? We knew that he grew up in a home very close within the same community of the Anderson homicide and the Sharika homicide. In January of 1993, he lived in an apartment complex right near where Lisa lived. In fact, Lisa would walk past that apartment complex every morning.
They were there to protect him from us.
I've been waiting for this moment for a long time. Why my mother? Why?
I wanted to hear from myself what he had to say for himself. Why that morning, that road, that day, why her? He had been getting high down in the park all night. She wasn't stalked, she wasn't followed. It was purely a crime of opportunity. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't show any emotion. He was very cold. But I got to look my mother's killer in the eyes and tell him how he had destroyed her life and how he had tried to destroy mine and how I wasn't going to let him have that power anymore.
The first question I asked him was, "Do you remember me?" And he flat out said, "Nope, never seen you," which everybody knew was a lie. He couldn't even answer a simple question. I'm not saying it would help. Maybe, at least it shows some remorse, but there was none at all. He had no expression, no emotion, no nothing. It's like he had no soul. It didn't bother him that we were sitting there. He had no remorse. None. I've realized I wasn't going to get the answers I wanted anyway, so I just walked out.
There's still a lot of answers that we don't have. We really don't know why he did this. Someone that can commit these type of crimes and continue to walk the face of the earth and tell no one about it, apparently have no remorse. Who knows what someone like that, who knows what they're thinking. It's a shame that Lisa isn't an adult now raising a family, that Mary Elaine Sharika didn't get to see her children grow up, and that Boomtem Anderson, her daughter's life was permanently damaged and destroyed by losing her mother as a child. It's just such a waste, and that one individual was responsible for it. It's just a shame, and as an investigator, you can't fix that no matter how hard you work or how much DNA you develop in a case or who you arrest. You can't fix those things.
Mom was here for the right amount of time. It wasn't what I wanted. It wasn't what I needed. But it was her time. And I'll see her again. No, I'm not angry with him. I really am not. Me being angry at him just takes away from me. One of the passages that has helped me when I think about Alex Watson is in Luke 6. It says, "Listen, all of you, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for the happiness of those who curse you, implore God's blessing on those who hurt you, and you will truly be acting as sons of God, for he is kind to the unthankful and to those who are very wicked." I think about the mistakes that I've made in my life, and I'm no better or worse than anyone else. And I know that God loves me anyway. I am just here to be as good of a person as I know how to be, and to tell people about grace that is available to them if they seek it. It's not my job to judge Alex Watson, but I hope that he has a relationship with God, and I hope that he knows that he can be forgiven for what he's done. Because I believe that. I believe that no matter what you do, forgiveness is available.
This is the reason why I stopped going to church. I had an issue that they're telling me that I have to forgive him to get into heaven. And if he found forgiveness, he gets into heaven. I have a real issue with that. I have no forgiveness for him. And I don't think I ever will.
Jennifer wanted to send a message to you.
Hey, Kimberly. I know how hard today is for you. But I want you to remember something. Your story is your story. Even though we all hurt the same way, we all had very different experiences. Just know that I'm here and I'm praying for you today. You have survived so much. And you're gonna survive today too.
The silence of a suburban night is often deceptive. It hides secrets beneath the veneer of manicured lawns and locked front doors, waiting for the right moment to unravel. It was a crisp October evening in 2005 when that silence was shattered forever, leaving a wound in the heart of our community that refused to heal for nearly 2 decades. We are talking about a cold case that haunted detectives, tormented a grieving family, and whispered through the corridors of every local household like a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. It started with a single, frantic 911 call, a crackling voice, heavy with terror, before the line went dead, leaving nothing but the hum of static and the chilling realization that something had gone terribly wrong. When the patrol cars arrived, sirens cutting through the dark like jagged blades, they found the front door ajar, swaying slightly in the autumn breeze, a silent invitation into a scene of unspeakable chaos. The air inside was thick, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the lingering scent of stale coffee, as if the victim had been interrupted in the most mundane act of existence. Investigators scoured every inch of the home, their flashlights dancing across walls that had once held photos of laughter and sunshine, now transformed into a backdrop for a brutal, inexplicable nightmare. There was no forced entry, no shattered glass, no signs of a desperate struggle that might explain the horror, just a chilling, surgical precision that suggested the perpetrator wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but someone who moved with the confidence of an invited guest. The victim, a pillar of the community, was discovered in the study, slumped over a desk buried in paperwork, eyes fixed on a future that would never arrive. Every piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued, placed into plastic bags, and whisked away to a lab that would eventually become the graveyard of hope for so many years. Forensics found a single, anomalous print on the inside of a wine glass, a partial DNA profile that refused to match any database, and a lingering sense of malice that seemed to permeate the floorboards. Days turned into weeks, and weeks bled into months, as the initial frenzy of the investigation slowed to a sluggish crawl, hampered by dead-end leads, witnesses whose memories were fractured by trauma, and the crushing weight of a town desperate for answers, but increasingly resigned to silence. The media storm eventually passed. The yellow tape was replaced by the mundane rhythms of daily life, but the cold case remained, a jagged shard of glass embedded in the town's collective conscience. Detectives moved on, retired, or were reassigned, but the files stayed in the archives, gathering dust yet pulsing with the unresolved electricity of a crime that demanded justice. Families of victims often say that the hardest part is not knowing, the agonizing uncertainty that turns every knock at the door into a phantom expectation, and for 19 years, that was the life they endured. A life lived in the long, dark shadow of 2005. They walked through the streets, past the house where the light had gone out, and wondered if the monster who had ripped their world apart was still breathing the same air, drinking the same coffee, and living a life of quiet normalcy while they carried the burden of his sins. The investigation took twists that defied logic, exploring theories of professional hits, crimes of passion gone wrong, and the terrifying possibility that this was a random act of violence committed by a predator who had simply vanished into the ether. Every anniversary of the crime was a fresh assault, a reminder that the scales of justice remained tipped, that a debt remained unpaid, and that the truth was buried beneath a mountain of bureaucratic failure and bad luck. Yet, in the modern age, secrets have a shorter half-life than they once did, and the shadows that protected the killer were beginning to stretch, thin and fragile under the glare of new forensic capabilities. Behind the scenes, the cold case unit hadn't stopped digging, revisiting the evidence with eyes sharpened by years of experience and tools that were barely a dream when the crime was committed. They looked at the DNA profile again, not as a static record, but as a map, tracing familial links across the country, crossing state lines, and burrowing into the dark corners of ancestry records that had never been touched before. It was a process of elimination that felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, except the needle was alive, and it had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 20. The handcuffs clicked into place, a metallic snap that echoed through the quiet suburban street like a gavel striking the desk of fate, marking the finality of a 19-year-long game of cat and mouse. The suspect, a man whose face had been plastered on the walls of the cold case unit's office for nearly 2 decades, stood motionless, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the officers, his lungs hitching in a rhythm of disbelief as the realization of his new, suffocating reality settled in. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the crumbling of a meticulously constructed life, a house of cards built on the foundation of a 2005 murder that had left an entire community reeling in the dark. For the detectives on the scene, the moment was surreal, a visceral collision of past and present where the ghosts they had chased through paper files and broken leads finally possessed a pulse, a name, and a pair of trembling hands they were now restraining. They escorted him from the home, his slippers shuffling against the pavement, a stark, pathetic sound compared to the gravity of the accusations swirling around his head. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, their phones recording, their whispers turning into a collective gasp as the man they had known as a friendly acquaintance, a helpful neighbor, a man who organized the block barbecue, was revealed as the specter they had feared for so long. The interior of his home, once a sanctuary of secrets, was now swarming with crime scene investigators, their lights cutting through the darkness of his private world, unearthing the tangible debris of a life lived in deception. Boxes were pulled from closets, hard drives were seized, and every photograph, every receipt, every scrap of paper was treated as a potential piece of the puzzle that had remained incomplete since that fateful autumn night in 2005. The detectives felt a chilling sensation as they moved through the rooms. There was a haunting ordinariness to it all, a sense that the evil they were investigating had become domesticated, housed, and nurtured within the very walls that looked just like their own. They found journals, the pages yellowed with age, detailing not the crime itself, but the psychological erosion of a man who had lived for years in the shadow of his own undoing. It was a descent into the mind of a perpetrator who had spent nearly 2 decades calibrating his mask, a mask that had been ripped away in a matter of seconds. As the suspect was processed at the station, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating weight of history. The interrogation room, cold and sterile, served as the theater for the final act of this long-dormant cold case. The air was heavy, charged with the static of unspoken truths and the ghosts of victims who had waited far too long for a voice to speak for them. The lead detective, a veteran who had inherited this case from a predecessor who had since passed away, sat across from the man, observing the way he avoided eye contact, the way his fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the metal table. This wasn't a standard interrogation. It was a conversation with the past, a bridge built of forensic evidence and sheer, unyielding persistence. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need to pressure him with accusations, for the evidence they had collected, the DNA, the digital footprint, the inconsistencies in his past, spoke with a volume that made words almost redundant. The story of the 2005 murder began to unfold not through a linear narrative, but in the fragmented, desperate admissions of a man whose defenses had finally shattered under the weight of his own shadow. He spoke of that night not as a distant memory, but as a vivid, corrosive presence that had dictated the trajectory of every day since. He described the cold, the darkness, the irrational, impulsive snap of his own humanity that had led him to that doorstep, a doorstep he hadn't planned to cross until he realized he couldn't turn back. The details were harrowing, the kind of specifics that would keep the detectives awake for weeks, etched into their minds with the clarity of a high-definition photograph. It was a story of obsession, of a grudge that had festered in the dark corners of his mind until it became a toxic, all-consuming flame. He didn't just confess to the crime. He confessed to the act of forgetting, to the way he had tried to scrub his own memory clean, to the way he had looked in the mirror every morning and tried to see a different man, one who hadn't taken a life in a burst of violent, senseless rage. The community, meanwhile, was in the throes of a massive, collective shock, a tremors-inducing realization that the monster hadn't been under their beds, but sitting at their dinner tables, sharing their lives and participating in the mundane rituals of their existence. People gathered in the streets, the news of the arrest acting as a catalyst for 1,000 conversations, 1,000 expressions of relief, horror, and profound confusion. The 2005 cold case, which had become a sort of urban legend, a cautionary tale told to children and a source of perpetual anxiety for the elderly, was now a reality, a tangible, brutal fact that demanded a reckoning. Schools, churches, and neighborhood associations became hubs of intense discourse, with residents grappling with the betrayal, the intimacy of the threat that had been hiding in plain sight. They talked about the times they had spoken to him, the times they had trusted him, and the chilling thought that their own perceptions of the world had been fundamentally, devastatingly wrong. The detectives worked around the clock, mapping out the timelines, connecting dots that had eluded them for so many years, their fatigue ignored in the face of a momentum they had spent a lifetime chasing. They were building a case that would stand the test of the courtroom, a mountain of evidence designed to ensure that the ghost of 2005 could never again walk free, that the justice delayed would not be justice denied. The victim's family, who had lived for 19 years with the hollow ache of an unresolved tragedy, were finally receiving the call they had feared would never come, the call that signaled the end of their long, agonizing wait. The emotions were raw, unbridled, a mixture of overwhelming sorrow and a tentative, fragile sense of peace. For them, the cold case was not a file, but a living, breathing absence, a void that had shaped their family dynamics, their milestones, and their daily lives. The arrest was not a magic cure for their grief, but it was an acknowledgement of their suffering, a validation that the world hadn't forgotten the life that had been stolen. They began to prepare for the long, arduous journey of a trial, a process that would force them to relive the most harrowing moments of their lives. But this time, they wouldn't be doing it alone, and they wouldn't be doing it with a ghost of uncertainty hanging over their heads. The suspect's defense team, meanwhile, began the frantic, uphill battle of challenging the evidence, of attempting to sow doubt into the fabric of a case that seemed woven from the strongest threads of modern forensic science. They scrutinized the chain of custody, the methodology of the DNA analysis, the circumstances of the arrest, their every move watched with intense scrutiny by a public hungry for a conclusion. The legal machinery began to grind, a slow, methodical process that felt like an eternity for those waiting for the final verdict, but it was a necessary, unavoidable path. Outside, the town remained in a state of suspended animation, the arrest serving as a permanent alteration to the landscape of their lives, a reminder that the past is never truly dead and that even the coldest of cases can ignite with the truth when the right sparks are applied. The media presence, which had once been a distant, infrequent occurrence, was now a constant, a swarm of cameras and reporters documenting every development, every rumor, and every reaction. The story of the 2005 cold case was no longer just a local tragedy. It was a national sensation, a narrative of redemption, of failure, of the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of overwhelming odds. Every detail, no matter how small, was dissected and analyzed, the case becoming a template for the power of persistence and the evolving nature of criminal investigation. As the days stretched into weeks, the focus shifted from the shock of the arrest to the anticipation of the trial, a theater of justice that promised to expose every remaining secret, every buried motive, and every shadow of doubt. The detectives, once considered the heroes of the story, were forced to confront the systemic failures that had allowed the case to remain cold for so long, their successes shadowed by the realization of how many lives could have been saved, how many years could have been spared, if the truth had been uncovered sooner. It was a sobering, reflective period, a time for the town to reconcile with its own history, with the way it had looked away when it should have looked closer, and with the way it had let a predator thrive in the comfort of its own ignorance. The suspect, locked away in a cell, became a symbol of everything the community wanted to forget, his existence a constant, gnawing reminder that the capacity for evil is not something that happens to other people in other places, but something that can reside within our own walls, our own circles, and our own lives. The narrative continued to evolve, the initial shock giving way to a more profound, more complex understanding of what it means to live in the wake of a crime that has defined a community's identity for a generation. The story is far from over, and as the trial approaches, the town waits, breathless and expectant, for the final piece of the puzzle to be placed. The 2005 cold case has transformed from a mystery into a mission, a test of the community's resilience, its capacity for forgiveness, and its commitment to the principle that no one, no matter how long they hide, is beyond the reach of justice. The echoes of that autumn night in 2005 still resonate through the streets, but they are no longer the hollow, lonely sounds of a secret. They are the rhythmic, determined beats of a process moving toward a conclusion. Every person involved, from the detectives to the family members, from the lawyers to the neighbors, is now part of a larger story, a testament to the idea that the truth, no matter how long it stays buried, will eventually claw its way to the surface, demanding its place in the sun. The suspect, once a phantom, is now a man of consequence, and the case, once cold, is now burning with the urgency of a story that finally has an ending in sight. This is the reality of the 2005 cold case, a story that isn't about the crime itself, but about the long, exhausting, and ultimately necessary journey to the truth, a journey that has changed the lives of everyone it touched and forced a community to confront the darkness it had kept hidden for far too long. As the trial date looms on the horizon, the tension in the air is palpable, a thick, suffocating shroud that covers every conversation and every thought. The town is no longer the same place it was before the arrest. The trust that once formed the bedrock of its social contract has been shaken, replaced by a new, more cautious, and perhaps more realistic perspective on the world. They know now that the safety of their homes is a fragile thing, that the people they think they know are capable of depths they cannot fathom, and that the only true security lies in the constant, unblinking vigilance of a community that refuses to be lied to or ignored. The 2005 cold case has become a permanent feature of their landscape, a landmark of their shared history, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the, at times, agonizingly slow march of justice. Yet, in the face of all this, there is a sense of purpose, a collective resolve that the final chapter of this story will be written with clarity and conviction, and that the long, dark night of 2005 will finally, definitively, come to an end. The detectives continue their preparations, their eyes fixed on the goal, their commitment unwavering, a testament to the idea that the pursuit of justice is not a job, but a vocation, a calling that transcends the boundaries of time, the limits of technology, and the constraints of the human condition. They are the keepers of the flame, the ones who kept the light burning when everyone else had turned away, and they are now the architects of a conclusion that will resonate for years to come. The family members, though still carrying the burden of their grief, are moving forward with a renewed sense of strength, a newfound confidence that they have been heard, that their pain has been acknowledged, and that they will be able to find the peace they have been chasing for nearly 2 decades. The trial, they know, will be hard, but it will be a culmination of their long, hard-fought journey, a public demonstration that their loved one's life mattered, and that the person responsible will be held accountable for the void they left behind. And the community, though forever changed, is beginning to heal, a slow, tentative process that is as much about confronting the past as it is about preparing for the future. They are no longer the same people they were when the alarm was first raised in 2005, and they will never be again, but they are stronger, wiser, and more united in their pursuit of a truth that no longer hides in the shadows, but stands in the harsh, unflinching light of day. This, then, is the story of the 2005 cold case, a story of shadows and light, of secrets and truths, of the long, arduous wait for the justice that finally arrives, not with a whisper, but with a roar that echoes through the heart of the community. As the legal proceedings commence, the world watches, not just for the outcome of the trial, but for the closure that it promises, a closure that is as much about the community as it is about the victim, as much about the future as it is about the past, and as much about the triumph of the truth as it is about the final, definitive resolution of a nightmare that has lasted far too long. The air is thick with the anticipation of what is to come, a weight that settles on the shoulders of everyone who has been touched by this case, but it is a weight that is slowly, surely, being lifted, replaced by the calm, steady realization that justice, for all its delays and all its failures, is finally, irrevocably, here. The 2005 cold case is no longer just a cold case. It is a testament to the power of persistence, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unyielding, often agonizingly slow march of justice that eventually, inevitably, catches up with those who think they have escaped it, proving that even the longest, darkest, and coldest of cases can, eventually, burn with the heat of the truth. The transition from the initial shock of the arrest to the clinical, sterile reality of the courtroom felt like moving from a nightmare into a hall of mirrors. The suspect, now stripped of his suburban camouflage and reduced to a defendant in a gray jumpsuit, sat at the defense table, a hollowed-out figure who seemed to shrink under the glare of the courtroom lights. This was no longer about the quiet, leafy streets where he had once played the part of the neighbor. This was about the cold, hard mechanics of law, where every word was measured, every piece of evidence weighed, and every witness testimony subjected to the relentless pressure of cross-examination. The prosecutor, a figure of icy precision and calculated empathy, opened case by pulling back the curtain on the year 2005, transporting the jury and the gallery back to that era of analog technology, landlines, and a time when forensic science was merely catching up to the brazen brutality of the killer. She spoke with a voice that cut through the stifling heat of the courtroom, painting a vivid picture of the victim, not as a case file, but as a vibrant, living soul whose future had been violently extinguished in a moment of inexplicable malice. The courtroom became a vessel for the past. As the prosecution began to lay out the timeline, the air grew thick with the weight of decades. They introduced the physical evidence, the recovered clothing, the items left untouched in the study, the digital trail that had been painstakingly reconstructed from archives that had been gathering dust for 19 years. Each item was a jagged piece of the puzzle, and as they were presented, the jury leaned in, their faces masks of concentrated gravity. The defense, meanwhile, sat like gargoyles, ready to strike at the slightest inconsistency, but they were fighting a losing battle against the sheer, overwhelming mass of the new forensic narrative. The DNA technology that had been the breakthrough, that silent, invisible witness that had finally betrayed the suspect, was described in detail that was both mesmerizing and chilling. It was science acting as an arbiter of history, a way of reaching across time to tap the killer on the shoulder and announce that the debt had come due. Every day of the trial felt like a descent further into the mind of a man who had lived a double life with such meticulous care that it defied common sense. Witnesses took the stand, former colleagues, old acquaintances, people who had shared space with him over the years, and their testimony was a chorus of uncomfortable realizations. They spoke of the man they thought they knew, only to have their memories interrogated until the cracks in their perceptions became glaringly obvious. They recounted mundane interactions, a conversation in the break room, a brief chat over a fence, a shared moment of professional success, and in the context of the trial, these moments became sinister, layered with the knowledge of what he had done elsewhere, at another time, in a life they never truly saw. The courtroom was a place of revelations, where the mask he had worn for nearly 20 years was stripped away layer by layer, exposing the raw, ugly reality of his character beneath. The victim's family sat in the front row, their presence a constant, silent force in the room. They had waited 19 years for this, enduring the annual cycles of grief, the birthdays missed, the holidays hollowed out by the empty chair, and now they were forced to sit within feet of the man who had authored their suffering. Their stoicism was heartbreaking, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute, unmitigated tragedy. Every time the prosecution presented a new piece of evidence, every time the details of the crime were revisited with clinical, detached language, the family bore the impact with a dignity that was both awe-inspiring and profoundly sad. They weren't there for vengeance. They were there for the truth, for the final, definitive acknowledgement that what happened in 2005 was not just a tragedy, but a crime that would finally be punished. The defense's strategy, as expected, was one of attrition. They attacked the methodology of the DNA testing, trying to sow seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury, questioning the chain of custody, the handling of the evidence over nearly 2 decades, and the validity of the familial matching techniques that had led the police to the suspect's doorstep. They painted a picture of a man who had been caught up in a web of coincidences, a man whose life had been unfairly upended by the obsession of a police department looking for an easy win in a cold case that had become an embarrassment. They tried to frame the narrative as one of bureaucratic desperation, where the truth was secondary to the need to close a file and claim a victory. But as the trial progressed, this narrative began to fray at the edges, unable to compete with the sheer force of the evidence, the consistency of the timeline, and the damning, undeniable presence of the suspect's own past. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, a palpable, vibrating tension that seemed to hum in the background of every statement and every cross-examination. This was a story of 2 timelines, the timeline of the crime, frozen in 2005, and the timeline of the investigation, which had been winding its way toward this moment for almost 2 decades. The clash of these 2 realities was the essence of the trial. The jury, a diverse group of individuals who had been plucked from their own quiet lives to decide the fate of a man who had lived in the shadows for so long, seemed to grow more solemn as the days passed. They heard from forensic experts who spoke of the permanence of DNA, how it lingers, how it marks, how it refuses to fade even when memories do. They listened as the prosecutor wove the disparate threads, the timing, the proximity, the motive, the evidence, into a tapestry of culpability that was impossible to look away from. The suspect himself remained a cipher. Throughout the testimonies, he rarely looked at the witnesses, his focus often fixed on his hands or the mahogany surface of the table. Occasionally, he would glance toward the gallery, his eyes flickering with a momentary, fleeting emotion that was impossible to categorize. Was it regret, or was it merely the fear of his own mortality? It didn't matter. In the economy of the courtroom, his internal state was secondary to his actions, and the prosecution was methodically building a case that left no room for the ambiguity he had thrived in for years. The court reporter's fingers flew across the keyboard, a constant, clicking rhythm that captured every word, every objection, every gasp from the gallery, preserving the proceedings for posterity. This was history in the making, the final, long-delayed chapter of a story that had been written in the blood and tears of a community that was now watching with bated breath to see if justice could actually be achieved. The evenings were spent in a blur of analysis and preparation. The prosecution team, exhausted but fueled by a sense of duty that transcended their professional lives, reviewed their notes, refined their arguments, and braced themselves for the next day's battle. The defense, fighting a rearguard action against an inevitable tide, searched for any loophole, any missed detail, any shred of reasonable doubt that could save their client from the sentence that seemed increasingly certain. And the town, outside the hallowed walls of the courthouse, waited. They had become an audience to their own tragedy, a community that had lived for 19 years with a phantom and was now watching the process of exorcism. They talked about the trial in hushed tones, their opinions shifting with the new revelations, their memories of 2005 being constantly revised as the details of the crime were brought into the stark, unforgiving light of the court. Every day, the courtroom was packed. People from all walks of life, those who remembered the original investigation, those who were children when it happened and were now adults, and those who had moved into the area long after the initial event, gathered in the gallery. The air inside was cool, kept at a constant temperature by the building systems, but it felt hot with the intensity of the gaze of everyone involved. There was a sense of communion, a shared understanding that what was happening in this room was important, that it was a reckoning not just for the suspect, but for the entire community. It was a test of their commitment to the idea that no act of violence, however distant, is beyond the reach of the law. As the middle phase of the trial approached its zenith, the evidence began to point toward a motive that was as mundane as it was devastating. It wasn't a grand, cinematic reason for the violence. It was a collision of petty grievances, misplaced anger, and a sudden, violent eruption of control that had spiraled out of control in the moment of the crime. The prosecution's ability to strip away the pretense of the killer's life and reveal the simple, ugly motive was perhaps their greatest success. They weren't just proving that he did it. They were explaining why, and in doing so, they were taking away the last, lingering sense of mystery that had surrounded the case. The mystery, which had been the source of the town's fear and fascination for 19 years, was being replaced by the banality of the truth, a shift that felt both like a relief and a hollow, sobering realization. The judge, a figure of measured authority, oversaw the proceedings with a watchful eye, ensuring that every nuance of the law was followed, that every right was protected, and that the process remained as fair as it was rigorous. Their presence was the anchor in the storm of emotions that the trial stirred up, a reminder that the courtroom was a place where facts, not feelings, had to hold sway. The tension was constant, a living, breathing entity in the room, shifting with every new witness, every new piece of forensic data, and every moment of confrontation between the defense and the prosecution. It was a marathon of discovery, a long, winding road that had started in a house on a quiet suburban street in 2005 and was now leading, through the labyrinth of the legal system, toward a conclusion that would resonate far beyond the four walls of the courtroom. The case was no longer just about the suspect. It was about the resilience of a community that had been forced to hold onto the truth for nearly 2 decades, and the determination of those who refused to let that truth be forgotten or dismissed. As the trial moved toward its later stages, the question was no longer whether the suspect would be held accountable, but what that accountability would look like, and how the community would begin the long, difficult process of moving past a tragedy that had been their constant companion for so long. The shadows were receding, not because the light was bright, but because the truth was finally being brought out one fact at a time, one day at a time, into the open where it could be seen, understood, and finally, firmly dealt with. The wait for the final verdict, which still seemed a distant horizon, was already beginning to feel like the end of a long, dark, and exhausting journey, a journey that had tested everyone, from the families to the investigators, to the very limits of their endurance and their faith in the system that was designed to protect them. The final resolution was approaching, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning, a world where the 2005 cold case was not a present, haunting reality, but a part of the past, a memory that, while forever painful, was no longer a weight upon their collective conscience. The court adjourned for the weekend, leaving the room in a heavy, expectant silence, a silence that felt different than the silence that had followed the initial 911 call back in 2005. This silence was not one of ignorance or fear, but one of patient, resolute anticipation, the calm before the final, inevitable reckoning that would bring the justice the family, the community, and the memory of the victims so richly deserved. Years. The breakthrough didn't come with a roar of triumph, but with the quiet ping of a notification on a computer screen, a hit, a connection, a name that hadn't appeared on any radar until now. The suspect, a man who had successfully integrated himself into a new life, a new job, and a new community, had no idea that the past he thought he had buried in the backyard of history was clawing its way back to the surface. Detectives watched him from a distance, documenting his movements, his habits, the way he laughed at dinner, the way he waved at neighbors, marveling at the sheer duality of a man who could hold such a dark secret behind a facade of suburban routine. The decision to strike was made in the dead of night, a tactical operation designed to minimize the possibility of flight, to catch the ghost in the machine before he realized the game was finally, definitively up. When the SWAT team surrounded his home, the air was just as cold as it had been that night in 2005, the symmetry of the moment lost on everyone except those who had waited so long to see it conclude. They pounded on the door, not with the curiosity of first responders, but with the iron weight of justice, and as the suspect opened the door, a look of profound, hollow realization washed over his face, the look of a man who had spent 19 years running, only to reach the cliff's edge. He was arrested right there, in the doorway of the life he had built on a foundation of lies, and as the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound echoing through the neighborhood, the long, painful chapter of the 2005 cold case was finally, violently, shut. The courtroom air, thick with the scent of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of suppressed anxiety, seemed to vibrate as the trial entered its fourth week. This was the stage where the abstract concept of justice was being forged into something concrete, something as cold and unyielding as the steel of the handcuffs that had signaled the end of the suspect's 19-year flight. The jury, a group of 12 individuals whose lives had been put on hold to serve as the arbiters of a long-buried truth, looked exhausted. They were being fed a steady, relentless diet of forensic minutiae, witness testimonies that spanned decades, and the agonizing, fragmented memories of those who had been forced to live in the shadow of the 2005 murder. The prosecutor, her movements deliberate and her voice steady, began to weave the final threads of her argument, linking the digital breadcrumbs of the suspect's life to the physical reality of the crime scene. It was a masterclass in narrative reconstruction, a way of forcing the jury to see the man not as the neighbor they had come to know, but as the predator he had been all along. The defense, increasingly cornered, shifted their strategy toward the psychological. They brought in experts who spoke of the fallibility of memory, of the ways in which 19 years of narrative building can distort the truth, and of the susceptibility of the human mind to suggestion. They argued that the suspect's life, his marriage, his career, his standing in the community, was proof of a man who had evolved, a man who had moved beyond the person he was on that fateful night in 2005. It was a desperate attempt to humanize the inhuman, to suggest that the passage of time had effectively rendered the perpetrator obsolete. But the prosecution's rebuttal was swift and brutal. They presented evidence of the suspect's own documented history, a series of small, seemingly unrelated incidents over the years that, when viewed through the lens of the 2005 crime, painted a clear, disturbing pattern of behavior. It wasn't about redemption. It was about camouflage. The suspect had not been living a new life. He had been living a lie, carefully curated to protect him from the inevitable weight of his past. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt like a pressure cooker. Every time the suspect shifted in his seat, every time a piece of evidence was entered into the record, the gallery reacted with a collective, stifled breath. The victim's family, who sat with a composure that bordered on the divine, provided the emotional anchor for the entire proceeding. They were the reason this trial was happening. They were the reason the cold case had not been allowed to dissolve into the ether. Their presence was a constant reminder of the human cost of the crime, a cost that could not be calculated in years or reduced to a cold file in a drawer. Their eyes, though filled with the ghosts of the past, were fixed on the defendant, a silent, unrelenting demand for the truth. For them, this was not just a trial. It was a ritual of reclamation, a way of saying that the life stolen in 2005 had value, that it had not been forgotten, and that its light would not be permanently eclipsed by the darkness that had tried to consume it. Outside the courthouse, the world continued to turn, but in the small, insular ecosystem of this town, time seemed to have stopped. The 2005 cold case, once a source of whispered rumors and fearful speculation, had become the defining narrative of the community's identity. People spoke of it in terms of before and after, the before being the period of ignorant peace, and the after being the sobering, complex reality of the present. They grappled with the implications of the arrest, the realization that the safety they had taken for granted was a fragile, illusionary thing. The trial had forced them to look into the mirror, to examine the prejudices, the blind spots, and the vulnerabilities that had allowed a predator to walk among them for nearly 2 decades. It was a painful, necessary process, one that left no one untouched and no stone unturned. As the day's session neared its end, the tension reached a fever pitch. A surprise witness, someone from the suspect's distant past who had been located only days prior, took the stand. The room went deathly silent. This was the kind of moment that people would talk about for years, the turning point in a narrative that had already seemed decided. The witness, a man whose hands trembled as he clutched the witness stand, recounted a conversation he had with the suspect shortly after the murder. A conversation that, while not a direct confession, was so damningly consistent with the prosecution's theory that it landed like a bombshell. The suspect's face, for the first time, showed a crack in his armor. He shifted his gaze, his jaw tightening, the mask of the friendly neighbor finally slipping to reveal the raw, exposed nerves of a man who realized that his long-held secret was no longer a secret at all. The judge, sensing the seismic shift in the courtroom, called for a recess, but the damage, or perhaps the liberation, was already done. The gallery erupted into a controlled, chaotic buzz, the sound of 1,000 realization-filled whispers filling the air. The detectives, who had spent years chasing this phantom, looked at each other with a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. They had done it. They had brought the ghost into the light. And yet, the exhaustion was plain on their faces. This had been a marathon, a life-consuming task that had demanded everything from them, and the finish line was finally, visibly within reach. The trial, with all its technical complexity and emotional weight, was moving toward its climax, and the outcome seemed as inevitable as the rising tide. The suspect was led out of the courtroom, his head bowed, his walk no longer the confident gait of a man who thought he had outrun his past. He looked small, insignificant, stripped of the layers of deception he had wrapped himself in for 19 years. The reality of his situation, the concrete, the iron, the loss of the life he had built, was finally setting in. In the holding cell, he would be alone, with nothing but the silence and the memories that he had spent so long trying to bury. For him, the trial was a process of erasure. For the victim, the family, and the community, it was a process of resurrection. The truth, as they say, has a way of finding its own level, and no matter how deep it is buried, no matter how much time passes, it will eventually rise to the surface, demanding its due. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the courtroom, the participants prepared for the next day, a day that promised to be even more intense, more revealing, and more final. The 2005 cold case was reaching its zenith, its legacy being written in the court records and the collective consciousness of a community that was finally, after so much time, finding its closure. The narrative of the trial, the clash of memories, the power of forensics, the resilience of the truth, was a testament to the idea that there is no such thing as a perfect crime, only a long, delayed justice. And as the town slept, unaware of the tectonic shift that had occurred within the courthouse walls, the story of the 2005 murder moved one step closer to its definitive, undeniable end. The echoes of the past were becoming clearer, no longer the distant, distorted memories they once were, but the sharp, ringing truths that would define the future. This was the power of the process, the relentless, grinding force of the law, and the unshakable, stubborn persistence of those who refuse to let the victim's story end in the silence of an unsolved cold case. The night air was cold, but there was a warmth in the anticipation of the next day, a feeling that justice, while long delayed, was finally being served, and that the nightmare of 2005 would soon be nothing more than a memory, a painful, haunting memory, but a memory nonetheless, one that would no longer have the power to destroy. The story was unfolding exactly as it needed to, a sequence of events that was as inevitable as it was necessary, leading them all, step by step, toward the final, crushing weight of the truth. The detectives, back in their office, pored over the day's transcripts, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their monitors. The office, once a place of frustration and forgotten files, was now a hub of triumphant momentum. Every piece of evidence they had meticulously collected, every interview they had conducted, every breakthrough they had facilitated was being vindicated. They weren't just police officers anymore. They were the guardians of a truth that had finally been given a voice. They talked about the trial, about the surprise witness, about the way the suspect had flinched, their voices filled with a quiet, professional satisfaction. They had done their part, and now they were just waiting for the final, concluding chapter to be written. The 2005 cold case, a case that had once been the bane of their existence, was now the jewel in their crown, a case that would be studied, discussed, and remembered as a prime example of the power of modern investigative techniques and the enduring, unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to give up. The world would eventually know this story, would know the names of the victims, the investigators, and the suspect, and would recognize it as a pivotal moment in the history of their community, a moment that redefined their understanding of justice, of truth, and of the nature of the monsters that can hide in plain sight. As they left the building, the city lights reflected on the damp pavement, a mosaic of colors that seemed to mirror the complexity of the case they were closing. The air was crisp, the wind whipping through the streets, but there was a stillness in the night, a sense of balance returning to the world. They had done their job, and now they could rest at least for a while. The trial would continue tomorrow, the lawyers would argue, the witnesses would testify, and the jury would deliberate, but the end was in sight. And as they walked to their cars, they knew that they had played a role in a story that was bigger than any of them, a story that spoke to the fundamental human desire for justice, for resolution, and for the peace that comes from finally knowing the truth. The 2005 cold case was coming to an end, and for the first time in 19 years, the community could begin to breathe again, not with the shallow, fearful breath of the past, but with the deep, steady, and deliberate breath of a people who have finally confronted their darkness and, in doing so, have found their way into the light. The courtroom, having endured weeks of agonizing revelations and the slow, rhythmic dismantling of the defendant's meticulously crafted facade, felt as if it were holding its collective breath. We were at the precipice. The prosecution had finished its case, and now, the burden of the defense hung in the air like a storm cloud that refused to break. The atmosphere was no longer just tense, it was vibrating with the frequency of an ending that was long overdue. The judge, a figure who had maintained an unwavering, stone-cold neutrality throughout these weeks, looked over the assembly with eyes that seemed to have seen every variation of human frailty. The defendant, once the portrait of a quiet, unassuming man, now appeared diminished, his posture sagging as if the very air in the room was pressing down on him, forcing him to face the reality of a ghost he had tried to outrun for 19 years. As the defense began their case, it became painfully clear that they were not fighting for an acquittal. That ship had sailed with the DNA match and the harrowing testimony of the surprise witness. They were fighting for the narrative. They were trying to paint a picture of a man who had changed, a man who had been a productive, tax-paying member of society for decades, hoping to sway the jury toward leniency. But every witness they called, every character reference that stumbled over their words, seemed only to highlight the dissonance between the man they thought they knew and the monster who had left that cold case behind in 2005. It was a tragic performance, one that only served to sharpen the contrast between the life he had stolen and the one he had managed to cultivate. The gallery watched, eyes darting from the defense table to the jury, searching for any sign of hesitation. But the jurors were granite. They sat with their notebooks open, their pens still, listening to the desperate pleas of the defense with an expression that was impossible to read, a mixture of fatigue, clarity, and, perhaps, a burgeoning sense of duty. They knew they were not just deciding the fate of a man. They were deciding the meaning of a decade-long mystery that had haunted their neighbors, their friends, and their families. This was the moment where the cold case stopped being a headline and started being a burden on their conscience. I looked at the lead detective, sitting in the back row, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look triumphant. He looked hollow. He had spent his life chasing this singular nightmare, and now that it was coming to a head, the silence of the courtroom was more deafening than the years of silence that had preceded it. It was a reminder that justice, even when served, does not come with a neat, happy ending. It comes with the cold, hard realization of what was lost and the impossibility of getting it back. The victim's family, still anchored in the front row, seemed to be physically leaning into the testimony, their faces masks of silent, agonizing determination. They were waiting for the final words, the final gavel, the final acknowledgement that their loved one had not been forgotten by the world or the law. The defense attorney, a man whose silver hair and sharp suit had been his armor, stood up to deliver his closing argument. His voice was a practiced instrument, low and resonant, designed to tug at the heartstrings. He spoke of the humanity of the defendant, of the 19 years of good behavior, of the risks of punishing a man for a version of himself that no longer existed. It was a logical argument, a legal argument, but it landed with a dull, hollow thud in a room that was filled with the ghosts of 2005. The jury didn't look moved. They looked tired of the pretense. They had seen the photos of the crime scene, they had heard the forensic reports, and they had seen the way the defendant flinched when the truth was presented, a reaction that was far more honest than anything his lawyer could fabricate. When the prosecution stood up for their final word, the courtroom seemed to shrink. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She walked to the center of the floor, let the silence build for a moment, and then began to speak, not to the jury, but to the memory of the victim. She spoke of the night of the crime, the mundane details that had been shattered, the unfinished book, the light left on, the silence that followed the 911 call. She reminded them that the defendant hadn't just taken a life, he had taken the future. He had stolen decades of birthdays, holidays, and small, quiet moments of joy from an entire family. She spoke of the 19 years of cold case frustration, the toll on the detectives, and the shadow that had hung over the community like a shroud. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of a hammer, striking down every one of the defense's attempts to humanize the man who had sat in the shadows for so long. The jury began their deliberations as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the courtroom into the amber glow of late afternoon. We all waited. The hallway outside the courtroom, usually a place of hushed, hurried movement, became a sanctuary of stillness. People stood in small groups, talking in low, reverent tones, sharing the weight of what they had just witnessed. It was as if everyone knew that the verdict, whatever it was, would change the landscape of the town forever. The 2005 cold case was about to lose its cold status, and in doing so, it would finally cease to be a phantom that lived in the dark. The hours stretched on, the shadows lengthening across the wooden floors, the fluorescent lights buzzing with an irritating, monotonous hum. Every few minutes, a door would open, and a ripple of tension would pass through the gallery, only to be followed by a wave of relief or disappointment as it turned out to be just a bailiff or a clerk. The air was thick, heavy with the electricity of anticipation, a feeling of being on the verge of a seismic shift. In the holding cell, the defendant was left with nothing but his thoughts, the 19 years of quiet, suburban life finally unraveling into the stark, uncompromising reality of his choices. He had lived a life of secrets, of careful, calculated movements, and now, for the first time, he had nowhere to go, no more lies to tell, and no more shadows to hide behind. The justice he had dodged for so long was finally standing at the door, and there was no way to lock it out. As night fully set in, the courthouse became a lonely, glowing structure in the center of the dark town. It was a fortress of truth, a beacon for those who had waited so long to see the light of day. Inside, the jurors remained in the quiet, sequestered room, their voices muted, their deliberations a slow, methodical process of sorting through the evidence, the arguments, and the weight of their own responsibility. They were the ones who would write the final sentence of this story, the ones who would close the file on the 2005 cold case, and the ones who would finally definitively bring the era of the mystery to an end. It was a burden, a profound and heavy weight, but they were the ones chosen for it, and they were the ones who would have to live with the result for the rest of their lives. I stood by the window, watching the city below, the lights flickering like distant stars, and thought about how many lives had been touched by the event of 2005. The impact wasn't just on the victim or the perpetrator. It was on the community, the town, and the very idea of what it means to be safe in one's own home. The case had forced everyone to confront the dark reality that the world is not always as it seems, that the people we see every day are capable of things that are beyond our comprehension, and that justice is a process, not a destination. It was a sobering, humbling realization, one that stayed with me as I looked back at the closed doors of the jury room. The wait was almost over, and as the night deepened, the sense that they were nearing a conclusion became almost tangible. The air was charged, the tension was high, and the world outside seemed to be waiting with us, holding its breath, waiting for the final, definitive word that would finally, after 19 years of silence, bring the 2005 cold case to its long-awaited conclusion. The story was nearing its end, and as the clock on the wall ticked forward, every second felt like a heartbeat, a slow, deliberate march toward the truth that would finally, undeniably, be laid bare for all to see. The courthouse doors remained sealed, a heavy barrier between the feverish anticipation of the outside world and the final, grinding machinery of justice occurring within. Inside the deliberating chamber, the air was stagnant, recycled, and thick with the smell of stale coffee and the palpable weight of 19 years of unresolved history. The jury, 12 ordinary people who had walked into this building weeks ago with only a vague awareness of the 2005 cold case, now carried the burden of a community's fractured psyche. They were no longer just observers. They were the final arbiters of a story that had haunted suburban hallways, dinner tables, and the very concept of safety for nearly 2 decades. They scrutinized the evidence one last time. The forensic charts, the timeline of the defendant's movements, the chilling, surgical precision of the crime scene photos that had burned themselves into their retinas. There was no room left for doubt, only for the gravity of the decision that would mark the end of an era. Outside, the hallways had turned into a limbo of whispered prayers and stifled anxiety. The victim's family huddled together in the corridor, their faces a map of endurance. They had aged in the shadow of this cold case, their lives punctuated by the annual, hollow anniversaries of a tragedy that remained a gaping, unhealed wound. For them, the wait for the verdict was not merely a legal process, it was a visceral reclamation of their past. They watched the door to the deliberation room with a gaze that was both weary and burning with a desperate, final hope. Every movement of a bailiff, every muffled sound from behind the wood, sent a shockwave of adrenaline through the crowd. This was the moment the ghost they had chased for 19 years was finally going to be exorcised, and the anticipation was almost too heavy to bear. The prosecutors stood by the window, staring out at the parking lot where the media vans were parked in a jagged, impatient crescent. She knew the weight of this case was not just in the conviction, but in the precedent. She had pulled a cold case from the abyss of administrative failure and built a bridge to the present using nothing but the fragile threads of modern DNA science and the sheer, brutal truth of a confession that had been forced out of the shadows. She felt the exhaustion in her bones, a deep, marrow-level fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the heavy lifting of justice. She had become the voice of a victim who could no longer speak, the architect of a conclusion that would be taught in law schools for years. She was ready, not for a celebration, but for the closure that would finally allow her to close the file and stop hearing the echoes of 2005 every time she closed her eyes. Down in the holding cell, the defendant sat on the edge of the steel cot, staring at the concrete wall. He was a man who had mastered the art of being invisible, a master of the mundane facade, but now, the walls were closing in on the persona he had painstakingly crafted. For 19 years, he had lived with a constant, low-level hum of the secret in his mind, the knowledge of what he had done, the fear of the knock on the door, and the perverse sense of accomplishment he felt every time he successfully navigated another day as a normal citizen. But that life was gone. He was no longer a person. He was a relic of a crime that had finally caught up to the present. He replayed the moments of his arrest, the way his suburban mask had shattered in the doorway of his own home, and he felt a cold, hollow terror that transcended the fear of a prison sentence. He was being stripped of his history, his identity, and his anonymity, and he was being forced to confront the reality that his 19 years of freedom were merely a long, elaborate pause before the inevitable. The atmosphere in the building began to shift, a subtle change in the quality of the light and the frequency of the sounds that signaled a change in the state of the trial. The bailiff, moving with a newfound sense of purpose, signaled to the judge's chambers. A tremor passed through the crowd, a collective, silent realization that the verdict was ready. It wasn't an announcement. It was a ripple of intuition that swept through the building, causing everyone to stand, to straighten their clothes, and to fix their eyes on the door to the courtroom. The wait, which had felt like an eternity, was suddenly, violently coming to an end. The silence was absolute, a profound, heavy quiet that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room, preparing them all for the final, definitive resolution of the 2005 cold case. The jury filed back into the room, their faces unreadable, their movements stiff and formal. They took their seats, the wood of the jury box creaking under their weight. The defendant was led in, his handcuffs clinking, his head held at a low, submissive angle. The judge sat, the silence stretching until it became a physical presence in the room. The lead juror held the paper, the document that represented the culmination of 19 years of waiting, of searching, of wondering, and of grieving. Every eye was locked on that piece of paper, a thin slip of white that held the power to alter the course of history and to finally place the final period at the end of a long, painful chapter. It was the moment of reckoning, the intersection of the past and the future, where the cold, hard reality of the law would finally confront the raw, agonizing reality of the crime. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreman stood, his voice steady, but carrying the tremor of someone who knew the magnitude of his words. As he spoke, the world outside, the years of cold case obscurity, the phantom of the 2005 murder, it all seemed to evaporate, leaving only the sharp, ringing clarity of the truth. The courtroom was a sanctuary of consequence, and as the verdict echoed through the room, a collective release of tension washed over the spectators. The family of the victim wept, not with the jagged, screaming pain of the initial tragedy, but with the quiet, profound sobs of people who had finally, after a lifetime of waiting, found the ending they had fought for. The defendant, now standing in the full glare of the truth, didn't move. He simply stared forward, his face a void, the final, absolute realization of his guilt settling over him like a burial shroud. The 2005 cold case was dead, and in its place, there was only the cold, unyielding reality of justice served. But as the judge prepared to read the sentence, the room remained strangely, hauntingly tethered to the past. The victory of the verdict didn't erase the events of 2005. It merely acknowledged them in a way that the world could no longer ignore. The legal process was nearly complete, but the emotional journey of the community was shifting into a new, complex phase, a phase of integration, of reconciling the monster they had known with the man who had been unmasked, and of finding a way to move forward in a world that felt both safer and more precarious than it had ever been. The verdict was the catalyst, the spark that would finally allow the community to turn the page, but the ink on that page would be stained by the memory of the long, dark years of the cold case. As the judge concluded the formal proceedings, the courtroom began to empty, but the energy in the room remained charged, a residual charge of a history finally confronted. The detectives, who had lived in the orbit of this case for so long, stood back, watching the family be consoled, watching the press scramble for headlines, and watching the defendant be led away. They were finished, but there was no sense of elation, only the quiet, professional satisfaction of a job done under the most difficult of circumstances. They had navigated the labyrinth of time and bureaucracy, and they had emerged on the other side with the truth in their hands. The 2005 cold case was a closed book, a testament to the persistence of the human spirit in the face of the unknown, and a reminder that no secret, no matter how deeply buried or how long it has been held in the dark, can survive the relentless, searching light of truth. The building began to return to its natural, mundane rhythm, but the atmosphere was forever altered. The trial had been a prism, refracting the light of the 2005 murder into 1,000 different pieces, revealing the impact of the crime on every level of their society. They would go home to their families, to their lives, and to their own versions of the truth, but they would all carry the memory of this moment, the moment the phantom was finally made flesh and held to account. The story was now etched into the records, into the archives, and into the collective memory of the town. The 2005 cold case had become a piece of history, a milestone of resilience, and a warning to all those who might think that the shadows offer permanent protection. Justice had been served, the long night was over, and the morning, while not necessarily brighter, was at least free from the suffocating, unresolved weight of the past. The silence that followed the final gavel was no longer the silence of an unsolved mystery. It was the quiet, steady breath of a community that was finally beginning to understand what it meant to live in the wake of the truth. They would walk out of these doors, step into the light of the day, and for the first time in 19 years, the road ahead was not shrouded in the fog of 2005. It was theirs again, to define, to navigate, and to live in, not as the victims of a cold case, but as the survivors of a long, arduous journey to the light. The case was cold no longer. It was a beacon, a signal to all who still lived in the dark that the truth is a patient hunter, and that no matter how long the trail, it eventually leads to the feet of those who have tried to run from it. The final, definitive chapter of the 2005 cold case had been written, and as the town looked toward the future, the ghost of the past was finally laid to rest, its power to haunt, to terrorize, and to silence finally, and irrevocably, broken. The gavel's final strike still echoed in the rafters of the courtroom, a sharp, resonant sound that felt like the snapping of a long-taut wire. For the spectators, the trial had reached its climax, but in the quiet, sterile corridors of the courthouse, the aftermath began to settle in like a cold mist. The defendant, now officially a convicted murderer, was led back into the bowels of the building, his movements sluggish, his gaze fixed on the gray floorboards. He was no longer the suburban neighbor who tended his garden with meticulous care. He was now just a number in a system that had finally, exhaustively, caught up to him. The transformation was complete. The mask had been peeled away, and what remained was the stark, pathetic reality of a man who had spent 19 years trying to outrun his own shadow. The detectives, standing near the exit, watched the process with a mixture of professional detachment and deeply buried relief. They had lived with the 2005 cold case in their pockets like a jagged piece of shrapnel for years, a constant, nagging reminder of their own limitations and the persistent nature of evil. Now, with the verdict secured, the shrapnel had been removed. They weren't heroes in the cinematic sense. They were simply men and women who had refused to let a file die. They had navigated the bureaucracy, the technological gaps, and the emotional toll of a case that refused to yield its secrets. As they began the process of packing away their notes, the stacks of documents, the forensic reports, the timelines that had defined their lives for the better part of a decade, there was a sense of profound, heavy silence. The case was closed, but the work of processing it was only just beginning. Outside, the town was undergoing its own form of metamorphosis. The news of the conviction had swept through the streets like a wildfire, transforming the 2005 cold case from a lingering phantom into a historical fact. People who had grown up in the shadow of the murder, who had heard the stories from their parents, were now grappling with the reality of the resolution. It was a strange, disorienting experience. The mystery that had provided a backdrop for their lives, a source of fear and fascination, was gone, replaced by the mundane, brutal clarity of a court-certified truth. They talked about it in coffee shops, at the park, and in the quiet of their living rooms, trying to reconcile the image of the man they had known with the evidence that had been presented in court. It was a community-wide exorcism of sorts, a forced confrontation with the fact that evil is not a distant, abstract concept, but a presence that can hide behind a friendly wave and a manicured lawn. The victim's family had already left the courtroom, slipping away through a side exit to avoid the swarm of media. They needed to breathe. For them, the trial was not a finish line. It was a transition. They had been tethered to the 2005 crime for nearly 2 decades, their lives shaped by the absence of their loved one and the grinding, agonizing uncertainty of the investigation. They had been waiting for justice, but now that they had it, they were faced with the reality of what it actually felt like. It wasn't a sudden lightness or a wave of relief. It was a heavy, sobering acknowledgement. The person who had been taken was still gone, and the years of silence could never be recovered. They were left to navigate the quiet of a house that was no longer haunted by a secret, but instead held the weight of a concluded tragedy. The legal teams, both prosecution and defense, began the process of deconstructing their strategies, their offices buzzing with the remnants of the trial. The prosecutors were already looking toward the sentencing phase, preparing the final arguments that would cement the defendant's fate for the rest of his life. The defense attorneys, meanwhile, were already looking at their notes, searching for any possible grounds for appeal, though they knew, in their hearts, that the case was as airtight as any they had ever seen. The trial had been a showcase of the modern forensic era, a testament to how far technology had moved since 2005, and they were all aware that they had been part of a landmark event. The proceedings were being recorded, transcribed, and analyzed, destined to become a case study for future investigators and lawyers who would look back at the 2005 cold case as the moment the rules of the game had fundamentally shifted. As the afternoon light began to wane, the courthouse entered a state of hibernation. The corridors were empty, the lights were dimmed, and the weight of the day's events seemed to seep into the very stones of the building. It was in this quiet, reflective period that the true magnitude of the resolution became apparent. The 2005 cold case had been a vacuum, a place where time had stood still, a repository for the anxieties and unresolved questions of an entire community. Now, that vacuum had been filled with the truth. The story was complete. There would be no more rumors, no more what-ifs. No more wandering through the archives in search of a clue that had been there all along, hiding in the dark. The truth had been found, it had been tested, and it had been proven. The suspect, now locked in a high-security holding area, was beginning his own internal process of reconciliation. He was no longer a neighbor, a friend, or a colleague. He was an inmate. He had entered the system as a man who believed he had successfully cheated time, and he was leaving it as a man who had been defined by his own past. The transition was absolute. He would never again walk down the street he had lived on, never again share a meal with the people he had deceived, and never again experience the illusion of normalcy. He had finally been brought to the end of his path, and the destination was the one he had tried to avoid for nearly 20 years. It was a bleak, inevitable conclusion, the final, crushing weight of justice that he had always known would eventually arrive. In the local library, a volunteer spent the evening scanning the local newspaper archives from 2005. The headlines from that era, once vibrant with the shock and horror of the initial investigation, were now faded, their yellowing pages a testament to the passage of time. They were being filed away, not as news, but as history. The story of the 2005 murder, which had once consumed the front pages, was being relegated to the annals of the town's past, a cautionary tale that would be passed down to future generations. The volunteers, who had seen the town change, grow, and heal in the shadow of the crime, felt a sense of profound closure as they filed the final reports from the trial. The record was complete. The account was balanced. The history of the 2005 cold case was written, preserved, and ready to be stored away in the silence of the stacks, where it would no longer have the power to disturb the living. The night air outside the courthouse was crisp and cool, a sharp contrast to the stale, overheated atmosphere within. People walked the streets, their conversations light and unencumbered by the tension that had gripped them for weeks. They were starting to live again, truly and fully, in a present that was no longer anchored to the failures of the past. The 2005 cold case was moving into the background, becoming a part of the town's narrative rather than its defining feature. It was a shift that was almost imperceptible, yet it was profound. The community had survived, it had faced its own darkness, and it had emerged on the other side, battle-scarred but intact, ready to move forward. The story of the 2005 murder had been one of the longest, darkest, and most persistent chapters in the town's history, but as the lights went out in the courthouse, that chapter was definitively closed, leaving only the quiet, steady progress of a future that was, for the first time in 19 years, entirely their own. The detectives, as they walked to their cars, paused for a moment to look back at the building. It had been their second home for so long, the place where they had spent countless hours staring at screens, poring over reports, and waiting for the phone to ring. Now, it was just a building, a structure of brick and mortar that no longer held the secrets that had once defined their work. They had done what they set out to do. They had brought the ghost into the light. And now they were free. They would move on to other cases, other mysteries, and other lives, but they would always carry the memory of the 2005 cold case, a testament to the fact that no matter how long the shadows may be, they will always, eventually, vanish in the light of the truth. The long, exhausting journey was over, and as they drove away, they could finally, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, leave the ghost of 2005 behind them in the dark, where it belonged, knowing that it had been put to rest, that justice had been served, and that the long, dark night had, at long last, come to its inevitable, definitive end. The courtroom had been reduced to a hollow shell, the silence that permeated its wood-paneled walls now heavier than the noise of the trial ever was. The sentencing hearing loomed on the horizon, but for those who had been in the trenches, the true weight of the resolution had already settled into their marrow. We had passed the point of legal maneuvering. We were now in the territory of legacy. The suspect, whose name was no longer synonymous with a friendly neighbor but with the cold, calculated violence of 2005, sat in the depths of the county jail. He had become a ghost in a box, a man whose existence was now confined to 4 concrete walls, his world shrunken to the size of a cot and a flickering fluorescent light. The transition from suburban life to incarceration was not just a change of location. It was a total erasure of the reality he had built, a reality that had always been a performance. In the hallways of the Justice Department, the investigators walked with a strange, aimless gait. The urgency that had fueled them for nearly 2 decades, the adrenaline of the hunt, the obsessive reviewing of files, the late-night sessions fueled by cold coffee and the need for answers, had evaporated. There was a void where that drive used to be. For many, this case had been the cornerstone of their professional identity. They were the cold case guys, the ones who wouldn't quit. Now, they were left with a professional vacuum. They moved through their tasks with a mechanical efficiency, but their eyes often drifted toward the empty desks where the 2005 case files had once dominated the landscape. It was a phantom limb syndrome, a realization that they had been defined by the very thing they had finally destroyed. They knew they would find other cases, other mysteries to unravel, but the 2005 case was a singular mountain they had climbed, and the descent was proving to be just as arduous as the ascent. The community, too, was experiencing a collective, slow-motion exhaling. The paranoia that had defined the town since the news of the arrest broke was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a strange, quiet normalcy. Neighbors who had treated each other with suspicion, wondering if the man next door was harboring his own dark secrets, began to relax their guard. The trial had been a mirror held up to the town, and what they had seen was a reflection of their own vulnerability. They realized that their fear had been the fuel for the mystery, that their silence and their assumptions had created the space in which the suspect had thrived. This realization was not easy to process. It required a fundamental shift in how they interacted with one another, a move toward a more transparent, perhaps more cynical, but ultimately more realistic social contract. The 2005 cold case was no longer a monster under the bed. It was a lesson learned in the hardest way possible. The media, which had swarmed the town like locusts at the beginning of the trial, had begun to pack up. The satellite trucks were leaving, the reporters were filing their final pieces, and the spectacle of the 2005 cold case was being folded away into the archives of sensational true crime journalism. For the journalists, it was a story with a beginning, a middle, and a definitive, satisfying end. They would move on to the next headline, the next tragedy, the next cold case that promised a dramatic resolution. But for the town, this story was their life. They had to continue living in the landscape that the crime had shaped, and they had to continue looking at the house where the victim had lived, the streets where the suspect had walked, and the spaces where the community had fractured. They would never be able to simply move on in the way a news cycle allows. I found myself back at the street where it all began, standing in front of the house. It looked remarkably ordinary, the paint slightly weathered, the garden overgrown in patches, just like any other house on the block. It was hard to reconcile the mundane reality of the architecture with the visceral horror of the events that had occurred inside. The 2005 cold case was a testament to the idea that tragedy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the middle of a Tuesday, during a routine, in the middle of a life that was supposed to continue. The house, which had been the site of a 911 call that had echoed through time, was now just a dwelling. The trauma had been the tenant, and now that the trauma had been addressed, if not resolved, the house was just wood and nails. The victim's family, I learned, had gathered for a final, private ceremony. It wasn't covered by the press. It was a moment of quiet, internal reconciliation. They had carried the weight of the unsolved murder for 19 years, and the verdict had allowed them to set that burden down, even if they couldn't entirely let it go. They had been forced to be the protagonists in a story they never asked to be in, and now they were reclaimed as private individuals. They weren't the victim's family anymore. They were mothers, fathers, siblings who had survived a long, dark odyssey. The peace they were finding was fragile, a new, tentative thing that had to be nurtured after years of neglect. It was a kind of survivor's grace, a recognition that while the past was indelible, the future was still theirs to claim. The legal system, which had been the arena for this conflict, was already shifting its focus to other matters. The judge had moved on to the next docket, the lawyers were preparing for their next motions, and the machinery of justice was churning forward, indifferent to the personal narratives it consumed. This was the nature of the beast. It was a relentless, grinding process that didn't stop for tears or catharsis. But for those involved, the detectives, the family, the community, the 2005 cold case was a life-defining event. It was a bookmark in their history, a point of reference that would organize the rest of their lives. When they spoke of the years that followed, they would always have to account for the shadow cast by that night in 2005. It was the before and the after that would always be the heartbeat of their perspective. As night fell over the town, the lights came on one by one in the houses along the street. It was a peaceful scene, a picture of suburban stability that belied the dark history that had been unearthed within these borders. There was a sense of balance being restored, a feeling that the debt had been paid, and the narrative had been closed. The suspect would spend the rest of his life in a room that didn't have a view of the sunset, and the victim's name would finally, properly, be cleared of the stain of being a cold case file. It was justice, in its raw, imperfect, and absolutely necessary form. It was the only thing that could be offered, and in the end, it was the only thing that truly mattered. I walked back to my car, the sound of my footsteps clicking against the pavement, the only noise in the quiet night. The 2005 cold case was no longer a mystery. It was a memory. And memories, no matter how sharp or how painful, are things that we carry, not things that carry us. We could finally set the weight down. The long, agonizing wait was over. The truth, which had remained hidden in the dark for so long, had been found, and it had proven to be the only thing that could set the town free. The final chapter had been written, the book was closed, And the story of the 2005 cold case, with all its secrets, its failures, and its ultimate, hard-fought victory, was finally at rest. The night was cold, but for the first time in 19 years, it didn't feel like a shroud. It felt like a blank slate, a wide-open expanse of darkness that was no longer hiding a predator, but was instead waiting, patiently, for the dawn of a future that the community could finally call their own, free from the lingering, oppressive ghost of the past. The journey had been long, but they had arrived, and the destination was the hard, enduring peace of the truth. The sentencing hearing, held in a courtroom that felt unnaturally antiseptic after the weeks of raw, chaotic testimony, served as the final mechanical movement in a long, agonizing symphony. The air was thin, almost sterile, as if the very atmosphere of the room was trying to cleanse itself of the trauma that had been exhumed and laid bare over the preceding month. The defendant sat motionless, his shoulders hunched, a hollowed-out figure who looked less like a man and more like the discarded husk of a secret that had finally been hollowed out by the weight of its own gravity. He did not speak, he did not protest. He simply sat, staring at the polished mahogany table with the vacant, unblinking eyes of someone who had already departed from the world of the living, long before the cell door had clicked shut for the last time. The prosecution's final statement was not a roar, but a whisper of iron. They didn't need to incite the jury further or appeal to the passions of the gallery. They simply laid the facts of the 2005 case on the table, a final, definitive accounting of a life stolen, a family fractured, and a community held in a state of suspended, anxious animation for nearly 2 decades. They spoke of the cold, hard reality of the victim's final moments, the deliberate, chilling choices the defendant had made, and the sheer, staggering arrogance of his attempt to vanish into the folds of a suburban life, as if he could simply wash the blood from his hands and start again, as an honest man. It was a searing, indicting narrative that left no room for ambiguity, no space for the defense to maneuver, and no comfort for the perpetrator. As the judge prepared to read the sentence, the room fell into a silence, so profound it felt as if the world outside had ceased to exist. This was the moment that the victim's family had been waiting for since that autumn night in 2005, the moment that the long, dark shadow of the cold case would finally be cast aside by the cold, unequivocal stroke of the law. When the words were finally spoken, when the number of years was announced, a number that effectively ensured the defendant would never again walk in the sun, a collective, shaky breath shuddered through the gallery. It wasn't a celebration, nor was it a relief. It was an acknowledgement. The debt was being called in. The reckoning was complete. I looked at the lead detective, the man whose career had been largely defined by his refusal to let this case go. He stood in the back of the room, his face etched with the weariness of a long, brutal campaign. He didn't smile. He didn't even relax. He simply nodded, a singular, sharp gesture of finality. He had reached the end of his mountain, and the view from the peak was not a panorama of glory, but a somber reflection on the cost of the climb. He had seen the truth, he had secured the justice, and he had done what he had sworn to do. But he knew as well as anyone that the truth is a double-edged sword. It frees you from the lie, but it leaves you forever marked by the weight of the reality you have uncovered. The defendant was escorted out by the bailiffs, his handcuffs clinking in a rhythmic, final cadence that signaled the end of his agency. He was no longer a person of the world. He was a ward of the state, a relic of a crime that had finally lost its mystery. As the door closed behind him, the courtroom seemed to physically shift, the tension that had held it taut for weeks beginning to drain away into the floorboards. The gallery began to empty, people moving with the slow, dazed motions of those who have witnessed an earthquake and are only now realizing they are still standing. The 2005 cold case was now a matter of record, a closed file, a piece of history that would be tucked away in the dusty cabinets of the judicial archives, rarely to be opened again. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, a jarring, physical reminder that life, in all its mundane, unscripted indifference, continued. The sun was setting over the city, casting long, orange shadows across the courthouse steps, turning the building into a silhouette of absolute, rigid authority. People were getting into their cars, heading home to their own lives, to the quiet, unexamined comfort of their own homes. The 2005 murder had been the central, pulsing heart of their community's identity for so long that its resolution felt like a form of amputation. They were relieved, yes, but they were also unmoored. They had built their fears, their precautions, and their stories around the mystery of that night, and now that mystery was gone. They were left to grapple with the aftermath of a reality they had tried to avoid, and the weight of their own culpability in having let the truth remain hidden for so long. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the city lights flicker to life. The mystery was resolved, the case was closed, and the monster was caged. It was the ending that everyone had prayed for, the ending that the victim deserved, and yet there was no sense of a clean, bright dawn. There was only the long, lingering twilight of a story that had consumed so many years. The 2005 cold case had been a long, dark corridor, and we had finally emerged on the other side, but we were all changed. The detectives were older, the family was broken and then slowly, painfully mended, and the town was more cynical, more careful, and more aware of the darkness that can thrive in the heart of the ordinary. The story is not about the crime itself, but about the endurance of the human spirit in the face of the unknown. It is a story about the stubborn, irrational, and absolutely vital belief that the truth matters, that the life of the victim is not a disposable thing, and that no matter how deep the shadows, no matter how much time passes, the light will eventually find its way into the dark. We had spent 19 years in the grip of a secret, and now we were free. But freedom, I realized, is not the absence of the past. It is the ability to carry it without being crushed by it. The 2005 cold case was our burden, and now we had set it down. The path ahead was unknown, but it was open, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the only thing waiting for us in the dark was the future, not a predator. As I turned to leave, I saw a lone figure walking toward the courthouse, a young woman who looked like she might have been a child when the crime occurred. She stopped at the steps, looking up at the stone building with a gaze that was both curious and solemn. She wasn't part of the investigation, and she wasn't a relative of the victim, but she, like everyone else in this town, had been touched by the shadow of the 2005 case. She was part of the generation that was growing up in the world after the truth, a world where the mystery had been solved and the ghosts had been laid to rest. She stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away, her steps firm and confident. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it felt like a final, beautiful affirmation. The cycle had been broken, the history had been written, and the town was finally, irrevocably, moving into a new, uncharted, and entirely honest era. The long, agonizing wait was finally, and definitively, over. The truth, which had been buried for 19 years, had risen, and it had proven to be the only thing that could set us free. We would carry the memory of the 2005 cold case forever, a reminder of our fragility, our tenacity, and the hard-fought necessity of the truth. But we would carry it as a memory, a story told in the quiet of the night, no longer as a shadow that dictated our lives. The long night was over, and as I walked toward my car, the silence of the night no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a promise that, despite all the darkness and all the secrets, we are still capable of finding our way into the light, of demanding justice, and of standing in the truth, come what may. The 2005 cold case was finished, but the truth, the beautiful, searing, and absolute truth, was finally home, where it belonged, etched into the bedrock of our town's story, for as long as we were there to remember it. The finality of the courtroom had begun to fade, replaced by the slow, grinding return of the town to its natural rhythm. But this was not the town of 2005. It was a place fundamentally scarred and, in some ways, liberated by the truth. The sentencing had done more than put a man behind bars. It had performed a psychological laminectomy on the community, removing the agonizing, festering pressure of a 19-year-old secret. As the weeks turned into months, the initial, feverish buzz of the media circus and the intense, collective scrutiny of the trial began to dissipate, leaving behind a silence that felt different. No longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an unsolved mystery, but the quiet, reflective stillness of a community catching its breath after a marathon. I found myself returning to the archives, not to hunt for clues, but to witness the process of history being solidified. The 2005 cold case, which had once been a disorganized collection of hearsay, contradictory statements, and incomplete forensic data, was now a neatly filed, legally binding record. It was a transformation from a living nightmare into an object of academic and legal study. There was a strange comfort in that. The volatility of the unknown had been replaced by the stability of the archive. The detectives, who had once spent their days in the trenches of the investigation, were now transitioning into a post-case existence. I spoke with one of the veteran officers, a man whose hair had gone white during the decades he spent chasing the ghost of 2005. He didn't speak of triumph. He spoke of the weight of the files he had finally been able to close. He described the sensation of walking out of the precinct on the day the verdict was read, feeling as though he had laid down a rucksack filled with stones that he hadn't realized he had been carrying for 20 years. The victim's family, who had been the central, grieving core of the entire ordeal, had begun a delicate, precarious process of healing. They had spent nearly 2 decades defining themselves in opposition to a tragedy, their very existence structured around the absence of their loved one. Now, they were tasked with the impossible, beautiful challenge of defining themselves in the presence of justice. It was a transition that was as much a trial as the legal proceedings themselves. They were learning to live in a house that was no longer a crime scene, walking the streets of a town that no longer looked at them with a mixture of pity and anxious curiosity. They were beginning to see the faces of their friends and neighbors again, rather than the ghosts of the past. The healing was slow, incremental, and entirely their own, a quiet victory that was far more meaningful than the public roar of the courtroom. The suspect, meanwhile, had vanished into the bowels of the state correctional system. He had become a non-entity, a bureaucratic digit that was no longer capable of influencing the lives of the people he had terrorized. The loss of his agency was total. He existed now only as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the banality of evil and the terrifying ease with which a monster can walk among us, masked by the mundane habits of our shared, fragile suburban reality. There was a cold, objective justice in his erasure. The man who had once feared the discovery of his past was now living in a world where he had no future, a fitting conclusion to a life he had built on the foundation of a 2005 murder. He was a relic, a piece of the past that had been placed behind steel and concrete, separated from the community he had once infected. The town itself had undergone a shift in its social fabric. The before and after was not just a historical division, it was a change in the collective consciousness. The 2005 cold case had taught them about the fragility of trust and the importance of vigilance. They were no longer the naive inhabitants of a quiet suburban enclave. They were a community that had confronted its own darkness and lived to tell the tale. This didn't make them colder or more fearful. It made them more resilient. They had learned that the truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, is the only foundation upon which a community can actually build. They were more connected, more aware of each other, and more committed to the idea that the secrets we keep are the things that keep us from being truly, fully human. I spent my final days in the town walking the streets, observing the way the light hit the houses, the way the neighborhood had returned to its routines, the school buses, the gardeners, the evening walkers. It was a scene of profound ordinariness, but it no longer felt like a mask. The history of 2005 was buried, not beneath the floorboards of the crime scene, but in the collective memory of the people who lived here. It was a part of the landscape now, like the old oak trees or the winding roads, a permanent feature of their identity. They would carry it, and in carrying it, they would be stronger. They would tell the story of the cold case, but they would tell it as a story of survival, of a long, dark night that was finally, unequivocally, followed by a new, if not brighter, dawn. The archives were finally quiet. The case that had been the heartbeat of the department for 19 years was now just a series of documents, a record of a journey that had tested the limits of faith, technology, and human endurance. There would be other cases, and other detectives would take up the mantle, but the 2005 cold case was finished. It was a closed loop, a perfect circle of inquiry, pursuit, and final, definitive resolution. I looked at the files one last time, the rows of manila folders, the digital backups, the forensic evidence that had finally, after 2 decades, spoken the truth. It was a testament to the fact that, in a world that often feels indifferent to the suffering of the individual, there are those who will not turn away, and there is a system, however slow and imperfect, that can eventually be made to work. The night air was cool as I prepared to leave for the last time. The town looked peaceful, a cluster of glowing windows against the dark, vast expanse of the night. It felt like a place that had earned its peace, a place that had paid the price for its secrets and had, in the end, been redeemed by its commitment to the truth. I felt a profound sense of closure, not just for the case, but for my own journey in documenting it. I had been a witness to the final, necessary act of a tragedy that had lasted nearly a generation. I had seen the transformation of a community from a state of victimhood to a state of truth. I had seen the triumph of the law over the shadow and endurance of the human spirit over the memory of the crime. As I drove out of town, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness, I looked back once. The courthouse was a silhouette, a sentinel of stone that would remain long after we were all gone, a marker of the time when the town had finally confronted its past and demanded an account. The 2005 cold case was a chapter in a much larger book, a book that the community would continue to write every day, with every action, every interaction, and every commitment to the transparency that had finally brought them into the light. The journey had been exhausting, the cost had been high, and the lessons had been learned in the hardest, most uncompromising way possible, but they were finally, at long last, free. They were moving forward, not toward an end, but toward a beginning, an era where the past, while forever present, would no longer have the power to define them. The truth had set them free, and it was a freedom that, for the first time in 19 years, felt permanent, solid, and undeniably their own. The night was vast and dark, but I was driving toward the horizon, and in the distance, I could see the faint, promising glow of a new, authentic, and truth-filled dawn.